Did you ever have a headache that was just killing you? And so maybe you took some medicine or you just did something else to distract yourself for a little while, and then suddenly you have that wonderful realization of,
hey, I don't have a headache anymore.
You didn't even realize it was gone, but you almost definitely would have noticed if it was still lingering around. In this video, I'm going to list a few of the headaches that you just have to deal with in other games that you may not have even noticed were missing from Final Fantasy XIV. Let me know if any of these are things that you hadn't considered before. Just to be clear before we start, Final Fantasy can't actually cure any physical headaches, so if you're having a migraine, please stop right now and go find a different remedy. It's okay, you have my blessing. Don't worry, I'm not insane. I don't usually play with a controller. I play on PC, so 99% of the time I'm playing with a mouse and keyboard, which I think is a far superior option for an MMO most of the time. Still, having the option to play on console or PC is something you shouldn't overlook either. First of all, obviously it allows all the players on PlayStation to play when they may not have otherwise been able to, but I think even PC players are sleeping on how nice it can be to pick up a controller during the story-heavy parts where there won't be as much action so you can just sit back and take it all in. I've set my controller's button so that I always have a few basic abilities handy in case I run into any mobs. Mostly I just want to make sure I have teleport and summon mount available so I can go from NPC to NPC all while leaning back and soaking in the story. I mean, just take a look at how comfortable I am. I've mentioned before that I've been something of an alcoholic in the past. I suffer from crippling class FOMO. I'm always terrified that I'm missing a transcendent gaming experience that's just a class away. Of course, that's still true in Final Fantasy, but since you can play all jobs on one character, you don't need to do things like reach a high enough level to use your mount, or double back to unlock fast travel points you've already unlocked. And you definitely don't have to slog through the whole story again just to see if Dancer is any fun to play. Spoilers, it is. The story in Final Fantasy XIV is unbelievably good, but I'm afraid it would lose some of its impact if you were forced to trudge through it again every time you wanted to experience a new class. Luckily for us, we don't even have to find out for sure. I'm on to you. Even after you emerge victorious in battle, you don't honor your fallen opponent's courageous fighting spirit. Oh no, you run up to their corpse and unceremoniously rifle through their pockets looking for anything of value. You're not picky, no. You'll take literally anything of value. Let's be honest, you've probably never left a single thing in those pockets as long as you still had space to carry more. All joking aside, have you virtually ever in an MMO chosen not to loot an enemy if you had space available? Did you ever once stop and say,
wow, I'm having so much fun looting right now?
Final Fantasy XIV understands this and merely automates the process of collecting loot, so you can skip the awkwardness of doing this every time, which gives a nice shot in the arm to the pace of looting enemies, especially when it comes to dungeons. Imagine you've saved up your money to buy something. For this argument, let's say it's a new console. You've done your research and you've identified which one has the perfect stats to fit your budget and your needs. You bring it home, you get it all plugged in, only to find that to your surprise, it actually performs a little bit better than you were expecting.
Score!
But then after talking with a friend, you realize that they got the exact same console, and theirs came with an even bigger performance boost. Now you feel gypped. So you get ready to return yours for a better one, only to find that the store has a weird arbitrary rule where you can only return it once per week to try again for a better stat roll. Okay, I guess the metaphor was getting away from me a little bit there, but anyone who's played high-level content in other MMOs knows the struggle of getting the piece of gear you wanted, but it didn't have the perfect stat roll. So now you're back to square one, grinding away some more. This is a uniquely terrible feeling. While Final Fantasy XIV does have random checks to see which gear is dropped, once that gear is dropped, the stats are set. So if you get the piece you wanted, it's always the right gear. Do you need evidence that Stockholm Syndrome is real? I feel like a complete dumbass for ever thinking that time walking in World of Warcraft was somehow acceptable. For those of you that don't know, time walking is the mechanic in WoW, where dungeons from old content are periodically and temporarily made available through the dungeon finder. Outside of these windows, those old dungeons are not available at all to high-level players. After experiencing level sync in Final Fantasy, it's become clear to me that arbitrarily limiting old content to random specific windows restricts the player for absolutely no good reason other than artificially keeping subscriptions going. It's really gross. And honestly, players shouldn't put up with it, especially when there are far better options available. I mean, Eorzea is right here for you. Okay, I'll admit that you probably did notice that Sylvanas isn't in Final Fantasy XIV, but you may not have given much thought to the fact that Final Fantasy doesn't really have a lot of those chaotically evil, one-note villains the way other games do. Sylvanas has devolved into little more than a cartoon villain, burning down trees and turning her back on the Horde which once welcomed her and her people. But the writers seem to imply that all of this is maybe okay because she was tricked into it or something. I don't know, I honestly haven't kept up with it that closely, but the important thing is that Final Fantasy XIV villains tend to have a lot more depth, and they usually have clear and consistent motivations, which is huge. Heck, even the Warriors of Darkness turned out to not be so bad in the end, and they're filled with darkness. This one was a big pain point for me. I've seen a few games have meta jokes like, go kill 10 bears.
No, I'm just kidding, you don't have to.
But the joke should really be, go get 10 bear pelts, because that's the one that really drove me insane. It was always much more infuriating to have a quest where you needed to collect an item, and that item just wouldn't drop. You'd kill a bear, and for some reason that specific bear wouldn't give you his pelt, even though you could see the pelt still on its corpse. You'd have to scour the area looking for that one bear that for some reason would give you his pelt. Thankfully, this isn't a thing at all in Final Fantasy XIV. If you need 10 bear pelts, you only have to kill 10 bears, period. It's amazing. Yeah, I know there are whispers out there about damage meters in Final Fantasy XIV, but apparently we're all collectively supposed to pretend we don't know those exist or something. It's honestly one of the weirdest things about the Final Fantasy XIV community, but I guess it kinda makes sense because Square Enix is really strict about add-ons or something. Still, I can't say that I haven't been pleasantly surprised by the positive impact the lack of damage meters has made on the game. Back in WoW, it's almost impossible not to focus on your damage per second, and not just so you can see big numbers pop up as you do damage. Although that's certainly a fun part of it. But it's also because it's highly probable that some toxic D-bag is going to call you out if your numbers aren't high enough. In Final Fantasy, with the lack of damage meters, you might notice that you're more focused on mechanics now, or more focused on keeping your party alive. It's overall a much more pleasant environment, which brings me to my final point. Where did that whisper come from anyway?
Don't worry about it.
Maybe you're not coming from WoW, which has a reputation for having a terrible community filled with hatred and rage. It's basically just a group of wannabe Sith. Instead, maybe you're coming from Guild Wars or Elder Scrolls Online or the Old Republic, none of which are really known for having unpleasant communities. On the other hand, their communities aren't really well known at all. Final Fantasy XIV definitely is. From the extravagant player-organized in-game parades to the smaller stuff like the way the majority of veterans seem more than willing to help out new player sprouts like me, it's clear that Final Fantasy XIV has one of the most welcoming and pleasant communities in all of gaming. So were any of these things you hadn't noticed were missing from Final Fantasy XIV? Let me know, and let's keep the conversation going with this video about the top 3 things that I think Final Fantasy XIV does better than other MMOs, especially WoW. Sorry WoW, I know I'm not supposed to kick someone when they're down, but I just can't help it.